Helen Keller was born on June 27, 1880, in the quiet town of Tuscumbia, Alabama. Her father, Arthur Keller, had once served as a captain in the Confederate Army. After the war, he returned to his land to build a new life, managing both his farm and the local newspaper. He was a reserved, disciplined man. When Arthur's first wife passed away, he later married Kate Adams, a much younger woman from a distinguished Southern family. Together they began a new chapter. Kate brought warmth and youth to the household, while Arthur brought structure and pride. To her stepsons, and even to Kate herself, he was always captain. In 1880, their daughter Helen entered the world, a radiant child whose laughter filled the Keller home. She was adored by her parents. Her mother found joy in her every movement, and her father, though stern by nature, softened whenever she entered the room. Helen would later write of those early days. "The beginning of my life was simple, and much like every other little life. I came, I saw, I conquered, as the first baby in the family always does." From her earliest months, Helen showed signs of remarkable intelligence. She spoke early, forming her first words like tea, 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 and wah wah, which her way of saying water. When words failed her, she invented gestures to communicate with her mother. She learned to walk quickly, and before long she was racing through the house, full of life and curiosity. But before her second birthday, tragedy struck. Helen fell gravely ill, burning with a fever that no medicine of the time could cure. Her family feared the worst. For days she lingered between life and death. Then, just as suddenly, the fever broke. Her parents rejoiced. Their daughter had survived. What they did not yet know was that the illness had taken something precious from her. One afternoon, while bathing her daughter, Kate noticed something strange. She waved her hand before Helen's eyes, but there's no response. Helen's gaze remained still, unblinking. Kate tried again, praying she was mistaken, but the child did not react. Helen could no longer see. Soon after, another realization came. When the dinner bell rang across the house, every member of the family paused, except Helen. She did not turn toward the sound. Her mother called her name. Her father shouted. Her aunt clapped loudly beside her ear. Helen did not stir. The truth became painfully clear. Their daughter was both blind and deaf. The Kellers searched desperately for medical help, but medicine in the late 19th century had no answers for their child's mysterious illness. The doctor could only confirm their worst fear, that nothing could be done. For Kate Keller, the sorrow was almost too heavy to bear. She looked at her once bright and lively daughter and wondered how a child could grow in a world without sight or sound, how she could ever speak, learn, or understand others. In the darkness that followed, Helen's world became a silent void. She could not see the sunrise that warmed the Alabama fields, nor the soft moonlight that settled over her home. The songs of birds, the hum of crickets, the laughter of those around her, all were lost to her senses. She lived enclosed in stillness and shadow, unaware of the vibrant life just beyond her reach. Imagine a life without sight or sound. No words, no music, no familiar voices. How would one make themselves understood? How would one speak without ever hearing speech? Helen's intelligence was undeniable even in those early years. She followed her mother everywhere, clutching her skirts as if they were her lifeline to the world. She learned through other senses. Scents told her who was nearby. Vibrations warned her that someone had entered the room. She began to understand her surroundings through touch and instinct. Over time, Helen developed her own language, a private system of gestures and signs. There were few schools for deaf or blind children in the late 19th century, and none in rural Alabama. Yet by the age of 5, Helen had invented more than 50 signs to express herself. When she wanted her parents to come, she tugged at their hands. When she wanted them to leave, she pushed them away. To ask for bread, she mimed the act of slicing and buttering a loaf. To say small, she pinched her fingers against her skin. To say large, she spread her arms wide. She even created unique gestures for each family member. For her father, she mimed the shape of his glasses. For her mother, she twisted her hair into a knot at the back of her head. Her family tried desperately to understand her, but it was never easy. When frustration overwhelmed her, Helen's temper flared. She would kick, scream, and lash out in rage. She knew people communicated with their lips, and she tried to imitate them, but no sound came. Her silence was a prison she could not yet comprehend. As the tantrums grew worse, her parents felt helpless. Some relatives urged them to send Helen away, to place her in an institution for the blind and deaf, as was common in the 19th century. Once sent to such places, children were often forgotten, rarely seen again. But Kate Keller refused to give in to despair. She looked beyond her daughter's silence and blindness, seeing not a helpless child but a mind filled with promise and determination. Yet one haunting question remained. If Helen could neither see nor hear, how could anyone possibly reach her? Still in the stillness of her world, Helen discovered small joys of her own. She wandered the grounds of her home in Tuscumbia, tracing her fingers along the walls, the leaves, and the blossoms that lined the garden paths. She learned the world through texture and fragrance, each touch and scent becoming a lesson. Though she lived in darkness and silence, Helen found her first understanding of life through the sensations that spoke most clearly to her heart. Helen learned small household tasks. She folded laundry and recognized her own clothes by texture. She noticed that when her mother put on her coat, it meant she was leaving, and Helen would tug insistently at it, wanting to go along. But ordinary moments in her life often carried hidden danger. One afternoon she accidentally spilled water on her apron. Wanting it to dry, she held it close to the fireplace. Unaware of the danger, she leaned too near the flames. In an instant, her apron caught fire. Her nurse reacted quickly, smothering the flames with a blanket. Helen escaped with only minor burns to her fingers and singed hair. She was fortunate. As Helen grew older, her intelligence was matched by mischief. She delighted in playing tricks on others. One day, she found a set of keys and realized what they could do. While her mother was in the pantry, Helen locked the door and sat outside, feeling the vibrations of her mother's pounding fists and calling voice. She smiled quietly to herself. It would be 3 long hours before Mrs. Keller was freed. Helen's closest companion was a young servant girl named Martha Washington. Though a few years older, Martha often yielded to Helen's strong will. The two spent hours together on the porch, cutting paper dolls or exploring the yard. On one such afternoon, Helen decided that Martha's hair should be cut short. Despite initial protest, Martha eventually gave in. Soon her hair lay scattered at her feet. Then, with a sense of fairness, Helen offered her own golden hair in return. Their laughter was replaced by their mother's dismay when she discovered the scene. Helen also shared her days with the family dog, Belle. She tried to teach the dog her homemade signs, but Belle would only wander off or fall asleep. Helen could not understand why her 4-legged student refused to learn. Life in the Keller household continued until a new arrival disrupted the fragile balance. When Helen was 5, her sister Mildred was born. For the first time, Helen sensed competition for her mother's affection. The baby occupied her mother's arms, her mother's time, and her mother's heart. Jealousy took root. One day, Helen discovered the infant lying in her doll's cradle. Enraged, she pushed it over. Her mother lunged forward and caught the baby just in time. The incident left Mrs. Keller shaken. Helen was no longer only a danger to herself, but she could endanger others. What would happen, she wondered, as Helen grew older and stronger. In their growing desperation, the Kellers sought one more chance for answers. They journeyed to Baltimore, Maryland, to consult a respected eye specialist, clinging to the faint hope that science might still help their daughter. After a careful examination, the verdict remained unchanged. Nothing could restore Helen's sight or hearing. Yet from this moment of disappointment came a glimmer of hope. The doctor mentioned a name, Alexander Graham Bell, the famed inventor of the telephone who had once taught deaf children and might know someone capable of reaching Helen. Early in 1887, that single lead guided the Keller family to Washington, D.C. Captain Keller and Aunt Evelyn accompanied 6-year-old Helen on the long trip, her mother gently curling her golden hair before they left. Helen, radiant and unaware, was about to meet one of the most extraordinary figures of her time. That meeting would mark the beginning of a transformation that would change her life forever. Inside Bell's office, the child and the inventor connected almost instantly. Helen climbed onto his lap, tracing the outlines of his face and beard with her fingers. Bell, patient and gentle, understood her improvised signs. Later, Helen would write, "He understood my signs, and I knew it, and loved him at once." Bell saw not a helpless child, but a mind waiting to be awakened. He believed that Helen could learn and perhaps live a fuller, more independent life. As Bell spoke with Captain Keller, he placed his pocket watch in Helen's hands. She felt its ticking vibrations, her first physical link to the rhythm of time. Bell then offered advice that would shape the years ahead. He urged the Kellers to contact the Perkins Institution for the Blind in Boston, Massachusetts, which is known today as the Perkins School. Decades earlier, the school had achieved a breakthrough in teaching another deaf-blind child, Laura Bridgman, to read and communicate through handspelling. Bell believed they might find someone there capable of guiding Helen as well. Upon returning to Alabama, Captain Keller wrote to the head of Perkins, explaining his daughter's situation and pleading for help. Weeks later, a reply arrived from Michael Anagnos, the school's director. He wrote that he had just the person in mind, a young woman named Anne Sullivan. The Kellers were elated. What they did not yet know was that Anne herself still needed convincing. Anne Sullivan's story began in hardship. Born into poverty, she had lost her mother as a child and was sent to an almshouse after her father abandoned the family. Afflicted with partial blindness, she was later sent to the Perkins School, where a series of operations gradually restored her sight. Despite her circumstances, Anne excelled. She graduated at the top of her class, known for her intelligence, determination, and fierce independence. At 20 years old, Anne had never taught before. She doubted her own ability, uncertain whether she could take on the immense challenge of educating a deaf and blind child. Michael Anagnos, however, believed in her. He saw in Anne a spirit strong enough to meet Helen's defiance with patience and compassion. The decision before her was not easy. Without this opportunity, her options were few, like factory work or an uncertain future. After weeks of persuasion, Anne Sullivan finally agreed to take on the challenge. For 2 months she prepared with unwavering focus, studying techniques for teaching the deaf and blind, mastering the manual alphabet, and even practicing with Laura Bridgman, who had once lived in darkness and silence as Helen did. Yet no lesson or book could fully prepare her for what awaited in Tuscumbia, Alabama. On the morning of March 3rd, 1887, the Keller household stirred with quiet anticipation. None could have imagined that this would become a day remembered in history. 6-year-old Helen, unable to see the smiles or hear the sounds of hurried footsteps, nonetheless felt the energy that filled the air. Through the vibrations of movement and the subtle tension around her, she sensed that something extraordinary was about to happen. Her mother moved briskly through the rooms, cleaning and preparing, while Helen, curious and eager, tugged at her dress, longing to be part of whatever was coming. That evening, at the Tuscumbia train station, a young woman stepped down from the 6:30 train. Anne Sullivan had arrived from the Perkins Institution in Boston. Her eyes, grey and sharp, hid traces of fatigue from the long journey, yet within them was a quiet determination. Townspeople gathered to watch the Yankee girl who had come to teach the Keller child. As the carriage carried her toward the Keller home, Anne gazed out across the Alabama fields. The small town, with its white fences and quiet streets, reminded her faintly of New England. For the first time in weeks she felt at ease. At the Keller house, Helen waited on the porch. She felt the carriage approaching through the tremor of wheels on the dirt road. When Anne stepped forward, Helen reached out for her mother, but instead touched a stranger's face. Startled, she pulled back. She did not like strangers, yet curiosity soon overcame fear. Her fingers explored Anne's dress, her hair, her bag. Searching for the sweets that guests often brought, she opened the bag and found none. Frustrated, she threw a tantrum. No one could calm her until Anne quietly placed her ticking pocket watch against Helen's cheek. The small vibration soothed her, and the storm passed. That night the new teacher unpacked her small room. Helen helped, then mischievously placed Anne's hat on her own head and twirled. Watching her, Anne wondered if she could ever reach this wild, willful child. The next morning, the lessons began. From Anne's trunk, Helen discovered a doll, a gift from the children at the Perkins School. Anne took Helen's hand and slowly spelled D-O-L-L. To Anne, it was a lesson. To Helen, it seemed like a game. But when Anne took the doll to spell the word again, Helen erupted, believing the gift was being taken away. The child's frustration was fierce. Every attempt to teach ended in struggle. Yet Anne did not yield. She brought Helen a slice of cake, spelling C-A-K into her hand. When Helen repeated the motions, Anne rewarded her. Though Helen was only imitating, not yet understanding, a seed had been planted. Days of resistance followed. At breakfast, Helen seized food from everyone's plate while her family looked on, helpless. Anne intervened. She insisted on discipline, an idea foreign to the household. Helen's rage shook the table, but Anne held firm. When the Kellers left the room, Anne locked the door and continued the lesson alone. For the first time, Helen met her equal in will. What followed was a series of fierce struggles between teacher and child, battles over meals, manners, and lessons that often ended in tears. Yet beneath the chaos, something deeper began to grow. Anne soon understood that to truly reach Helen, she had to separate her from the constant indulgence of her family. With the Kellers' permission, she moved with Helen into a small cottage nearby, telling the child they had journeyed far from home. In that quiet refuge without distraction, teacher and pupil faced each other in a test of will and patience. Days were long and demanding, but slowly Helen began to yield, to trust, and to listen with her hands. Then, on April 5th, 1887, came the moment that changed everything. While helping to wash dishes, Helen felt water run over her fingers. Sensing the opportunity, Anne led her outside to the water pump, placed her hand beneath the cold stream, and repeatedly spelled the word water into her palm. Suddenly, Helen froze. The motions of the letters and the flow of water joined in meaning. She dropped the mug, stood still, and traced the word back into Anne's hand. In that instant, the silent darkness of her world lifted. For the first time, Helen understood that every object had a name, and that language could open the world to her. Helen would later write, "Everything had a name, and each name gave birth to a new thought." That moment broke the wall of darkness. Anne became teacher, and Helen's education began in earnest. Lessons moved outdoors where the world itself became their classroom. By the river, Helen learned geography, carving canals and mountains from the dirt. In the garden, she studied nature. Her vocabulary expanded rapidly with hundreds of words by summer's end. She learned verbs, adjectives, even abstract ideas like think and love. Annie wrote to Michael Anagnos at the Perkins School, describing the child's progress. Word spread quickly. Newspapers called Helen the Wonder Child, marveling at the miracle in Alabama. By the end of that remarkable year, Helen had learned to read and write in Braille. She composed letters to other blind children at the Perkins Institution, eager to share her newfound voice. Each evening, as Annie spelled fairy tales and legends into her palm, Helen's imagination soared beyond the limits of darkness and silence. For the first time, her mind felt free, her spirit unbound, and her hands became her voice, a language through which the world could finally hear her. Not long after, the teacher and pupil set out from Washington, D.C., boarding a train bound for Boston. Their destination was the Perkins Institution for the Blind, the very place where miracles of learning had once been achieved, and where Helen Keller's journey toward knowledge and independence would continue. At Perkins, Helen met the school's most famous former student, Laura Bridgman, now middle-aged. The meeting, however, did not go as Annie had hoped. Laura, proper and reserved, thought Helen far too unruly. When Helen, unaware of etiquette, sat cross-legged on the floor, Laura disapproved. As they parted, Helen accidentally stepped on Laura's toes. Laura cried out in pain, and Helen, embarrassed, felt like a clumsy child. Some found Helen's laughter and energy unbecoming of a young lady. But Annie disagreed. She saw a spirited girl full of curiosity and determination. She wanted Helen to embrace life, not shrink from it. That summer, Helen took part in the Perkins commencement ceremony, a major event attended by scholars, politicians, and philanthropists. The governor of Massachusetts sat among the guests as a brass band played. Helen waited patiently on the platform until it was her turn. When it came, she spelled a poem about birds into Annie's hand, and Annie spoke the words aloud. The audience sat in rapt silence. For the first time, they saw the miracle for themselves. When the school term ended, Annie and Helen travelled to Cape Cod, where Helen experienced the ocean for the first time. The cold, salty waves thrilled her. Then, one afternoon, the current pulled her beneath the surface. Disoriented and frightened, she fought to reach the shore. When she finally staggered onto the sand, Annie rushed to comfort her. 2 days later, Helen returned to the sea undaunted. Her only question afterward was simple and sincere. Who put the salt in the ocean? Back in Alabama, Annie soon realized that Helen's progress required a broader world. The isolation of rural life limited her education. Curious stares and small-town whispers followed them wherever they went. Annie persuaded the Kellers to let them return to Boston and live at Perkins. Reluctantly, they agreed. In October 1888, the two returned north. Helen was not officially enrolled as a student, but was welcomed as a guest. She threw herself into study, geography, botany, zoology, and arithmetic, though numbers were never her strength. Her passion was language and literature. She read poetry and soon began to write her own. Helen even met the renowned poet Oliver Wendell Holmes, whose warmth and intellect left a deep impression on her. Later, she wrote him a letter, expressing both admiration and youthful innocence. Holmes was so touched by her words that he published the letter in the Atlantic Monthly. The recognition strengthened Helen's belief in the power of writing. In the spring of 1890, a teacher named Mary Swift Lampson returned from Norway with remarkable news. A deaf-blind girl there had learned to speak. The revelation ignited a new dream in Helen's heart. She wanted to learn to speak too. Annie tried to prepare her for disappointment. Teaching speech to someone who could not hear was almost impossible. But Helen's determination left no room for doubt. With Annie's support, Helen began lessons. Her teacher guided her hands to feel the movements of lips and tongue as words were formed. By the end of her first lesson, Helen could pronounce several letters. Her voice was rough, but her triumph was immense. Over time, she learned to form words, yet her speech would never be clear, a lifelong frustration that made her feel apart from others. At 11, Helen wrote a story called The Frost King and sent it to Michael Anagnos, the director of Perkins, as a birthday gift. It was printed in the school's magazine, The Mentor, and praised for its beauty. But soon, a shocking discovery surfaced. Another story, The Frost Fairies, was found to be nearly identical. Helen's joy turned to despair. Accused of plagiarism, she stood alone before a committee of 8 teachers, half blind, half sighted. Without Annie to guide her, Helen trembled with fear. "The blood pressed about my thumping heart," she later wrote, "and I could scarcely speak." The panel questioned her relentlessly. "Who read you that story?" Helen could not answer. She had no memory of ever hearing it. Though most of the committee believed she was innocent, Michael Anagnos could not shake his doubt. His trust in Annie and Helen was broken, and their friendship ended. Helen's time at Perkins came to a painful close. Back in Alabama, Helen's spirit dimmed. Illness left her withdrawn and uncertain, and for months she questioned whether her thoughts were truly her own. The experience wounded her deeply, shaking the confidence she once held as a writer. Yet Helen's resilience, shaped by years of struggle, slowly began to mend what had been broken. By summer's end, her curiosity returned, and with it, a quiet determination to continue learning. Her journey of education, though tested, was far from finished. When her time at the Perkins Institution came to a close, a new door quietly opened. In 1894, Anne Sullivan learned of the Wright Humason School for the Deaf in New York City, founded by Dr. Thomas Humason and John Wright. The school offered both academic and speech training, providing exactly the kind of environment Helen needed to grow beyond the limits that once confined her world. But the question remained, how would the Kellers afford it? Helen's father, once comfortable, had fallen on hard times. The family's finances were strained. Yet Helen's growing reputation had brought her into contact with influential figures, men like Alexander Graham Bell, John D. Rockefeller, and John Spaulding. It was Spaulding who offered to sponsor her education. With that generosity, Annie and Helen packed their bags and set out for New York. They settled into a handsome house near Central Park, a world far removed from rural Alabama. At the Wright Humason School, Helen studied a demanding curriculum: arithmetic, English literature, American history, French, and German. She also received lessons in lip reading and speech, continuing her effort to master spoken language. Arithmetic remained her greatest challenge, but literature was her joy. By now, Helen's fame was spreading beyond Boston. A reporter from the New York Times came expecting to meet a shy, reserved girl. Instead, he encountered a bright, self-assured 15-year-old who laughed freely, joked easily, and radiated charm. Helen was not a fragile symbol of pity. She was alive, curious, and confident. During these years, Annie arranged excursions to show Helen the wider world. Helen climbed to the top of the Statue of Liberty, where she described the air as fresher and the wind as familiar, like the breezes of Cape Cod. She attended a dog show at Madison Square Garden, delighting in the company of her favourite animals, but one visit left a deeper impression. On the Lower East Side, Helen and Annie walked through the crowded tenements where immigrants from Europe struggled to survive. 10 or more people lived together in a single, dimly lit room. Though Helen could not see their faces, she sensed the hardship in the roughness of their clothes, the smell of machine oil and street dust, and the press of bodies around her. It was her first real encounter with poverty, and it stirred something within her. In New York, Helen also met many of the city's leading figures. Among them was Mark Twain, the celebrated author of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. Twain watched in admiration as Helen read Lips Through Touch. The two spoke at length, and when Helen left, she tucked a small bouquet of violets into his buttonhole. It was the beginning of a lifelong friendship between two of America's great voices. Beyond her studies, Helen delighted in the rhythms of city life. She rode horses in Central Park, felt the wind on her face as she raced down snowy hills on a bobsled, and discovered a sense of freedom that stretched far beyond the classroom. Yet even as she embraced these moments of joy, her ambitions reached higher. At the dawn of the 20th century, when few women pursued higher education, and none who were both deaf and blind had ever done so, Helen set her sights on an extraordinary goal. She would attend Radcliffe College, the esteemed women's division of Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The path ahead would be demanding, but for Helen Keller, the pursuit of knowledge had always been worth every challenge. Helen learned that to qualify for Radcliffe, she would need to attend the Cambridge School for Young Ladies, a preparatory academy that trained women for higher education. Her teacher, Anne Sullivan, met with the school's headmaster, Arthur Gilman, and pleaded for Helen's admission. He was astonished by the request and asked for time to consider. For Helen and Annie, his decision would determine the course of their lives. As they waited, tragedy struck. Helen's father, Captain Arthur Keller, passed away in Alabama. Helen longed to return home, but her mother forbade the journey. It was the height of summer, a season when disease spread easily in the South. The risk was too great. Isolated in Massachusetts, Helen grieved in silence. Then the long-awaited answer came. Helen had been accepted, yet with triumph came fear. For the first time she doubted herself. Could she compete with other students? Could she meet the expectations of a demanding institution? At the Cambridge School, Helen seemed at first like any other student. She and Annie shared a room in Howell's house, one of the dormitories. Helen made friends quickly. Some of her classmates even learned the manual alphabet to communicate with her. She joined them in walks and games between long hours of study. Her courses included English, history, Latin, and German. But few textbooks existed in Braille, and Helen depended entirely on Annie, who read every lesson aloud through touch. When unfamiliar words appeared, whether in German or French, Annie looked them up and spelled them into Helen's hand. Helen pushed herself relentlessly, determined to complete the 5-year course in only 3. The effort soon took a toll. Helen became exhausted and frail. Her sister Mildred, who had also joined the school, noticed that Helen seemed perpetually weak and pale. Concerned, Mrs. Keller began to fear that Annie was driving her daughter too hard. Arthur Gilman shared that view. He believed that Annie's influence over Helen had become too strong. For nearly a decade, teacher and student had been inseparable. Perhaps, he suggested, it was time for Helen to gain her independence, but Helen refused. Without Annie, she said, she could not go on. In the end, Mrs. Keller sided with her daughter. Helen withdrew from the Cambridge School, and the two moved to Wrentham, Massachusetts, where Helen continued her studies with private tutors. In June of 1899, Helen took the Radcliffe entrance examinations. She was 19, a year older than most applicants, and feared she had failed. But the results proved otherwise. She passed with strong marks. Her acceptance letter arrived on July 4, 1899, a fitting day of celebration. Fireworks filled the sky, and Helen felt they exploded for her alone. The dean suggested she delay enrollment for a year, but Helen would not wait. In September, Helen entered Radcliffe College as a freshman, making history as the first deaf-blind woman to study at one of America's most respected universities. Reflecting on that moment, she would later write, "In the wonderland of mind, I should be as free as another." For Helen, whose early world had been bound by silence and shadow, the gates of knowledge now opened wider than ever before. Her college years began with determination, but the challenges that awaited were immense. If the Cambridge School had tested her strength, Radcliffe would push it to the edge. Every lecture had to be spelled into her hand by Anne Sullivan, who also read each textbook aloud. The pace was unrelenting, leaving no room for rest or hesitation. Together, teacher and student worked tirelessly, their shared persistence turning what once seemed impossible into daily triumphs. Isolation added to the strain. Helen and Annie lived off campus in a small rented house. The other students were kind but uncertain how to speak or act around her. Some avoided her entirely, intimidated by her fame. For Helen, it was a lonely existence filled with endless work and little rest. Despite the hardship, Helen persisted. Her days were spent studying and memorizing, her nights filled with writing and review. She had no time for idle thought or leisure. Her first year at Radcliffe was marked by exhaustion, yet also by quiet determination. In her second year, Helen began to write short essays, reflections on her own life and experiences. An editor from Ladies' Home Journal learned of them and offered to publish her work, paying the remarkable sum of $3,000. Encouraged, Helen began what would become her first book, The Story of My Life. Each month, the magazine printed a new chapter. Readers were fascinated. Yet as the series continued, Helen and Annie struggled with revisions. Neither had formal training in editing. A friend suggested they seek help from John Macy, a skilled editor and literary critic. Macy worked closely with them, shaping Helen's words for publication. The articles were a success, and by the time the final installment appeared, the public had fallen deeply in love with Helen Keller. Macy encouraged Helen to compile her essays into a book, adding her childhood letters and a section recounting Annie's teaching methods. When The Story of My Life appeared in 1903, it became an instant success. The book remains in print today and has been translated into more than 50 languages. It established Helen not merely as a subject of fascination, but as a writer in her own right, a voice from silence. In June 1904, Helen Keller graduated with honours from Radcliffe College. Newspapers around the world hailed the achievement. She had done what no person with her disabilities had ever accomplished. Yet the question remained, what would come next? That same year, Annie faced her own decision. She and John Macy had fallen in love. He asked her to marry him, but Annie hesitated. What would become of Helen if she did? Could Helen live more independently, or did she still need her constant guidance? At last, Annie agreed to the marriage, and in 1905 she became Mrs. John Macy. Helen continued to live with the couple, their lives intertwined by shared purpose and devotion. After the publication of The World I Live in 1908, Helen returned to writing with renewed purpose. The book offered readers a glimpse into her inner world, describing how she experienced life through touch, scent, and taste. Critics praised her eloquence and imagination, admiring how she had built a vivid landscape of understanding in place of sight and sound. Yet success brought little financial comfort. The modest royalties from her books were not enough to sustain her, and once again she faced the challenge of earning a living. Determined to find a new way to connect with others, Helen stepped onto the stage for the first time. Her debut public speech took place in Montclair, New Jersey, with Anne Sullivan, her steadfast teacher, beside her. Nervous but resolute, Helen wondered if her voice, shaped through touch and vibration, would be understood. As she spoke of her life, her words wavered and her tone strained, but her sincerity touched every heart in the audience. Their applause thundered through the hall, marking the beginning of her public life and the first of many invitations to share her story with the world. By 1913, Helen and Annie embarked on a national lecture tour, travelling across the United States. Helen spoke of her journey from silence into language, of perseverance and of faith in the human spirit. Annie opened each lecture and closed with reflections on their shared triumph. Wherever they went, audiences greeted them with admiration and affection. Helen's fame on stage led to an unexpected proposal from Hollywood. She and Annie were invited to make a silent film about her life, titled Deliverance. The two women hoped it would bring financial stability and recognition. Yet when the film was released, it failed to find an audience. Disheartened, they returned to Wrentham, Massachusetts, facing new trials. Annie's eyesight had begun to fail completely, and her marriage to John Macy had collapsed. Blindness now loomed over the woman who had once opened Helen's eyes to the world. Heartbroken, Annie withdrew, while Helen continued answering letters from admirers around the world. Despite her international fame, Helen's finances were precarious. Then came an unexpected offer. Two vaudeville producers in New York proposed a 20-minute stage act featuring Helen and Annie. Their friends were horrified. Helen's mother begged her to refuse. They feared the act would exploit her disabilities, turning her into a spectacle. But Helen, ever independent, accepted. She believed it would be both challenging and enjoyable. Their first performance took place on February 24th, 1920, at the Palace Theatre in New York City. Annie opened with her account of Helen's education, her voice steady and warm. Then, as music swelled, Helen stepped through the curtains to the edge of the stage. Together, they reenacted the miracle at the water pump, the moment Helen first understood the meaning of words. When the act ended, the audience rose in thunderous applause. Their tour was an astonishing success. Helen and Annie became among the highest-paid performers in vaudeville, earning as much as $2,500 a week. Though Annie worried that some came only out of curiosity, most came out of genuine admiration. Helen loved the theatre. She enjoyed meeting other performers, feeling the rhythm of the stage and the hum of life behind the curtain. "It feels," she said, "like being part of a family." In 1924, Helen accepted a new role, one that would define the remainder of her life. She joined the American Foundation for the Blind as a national spokesperson and advocate. Her mission was clear: to improve the lives of the blind through education, opportunity, and understanding. A year later, she paused her travels to write another book, reflecting on her college years and her growing work in advocacy. Published in 1929 as Midstream, the book became a bestseller. But that same year, the stock market crashed, plunging the nation into the Great Depression. Economic hardship spread across America, and Helen's small household was not spared. Annie's health deteriorated further. Her eyesight failed completely, and illness confined her to her bed. Helen remained at her side, ensuring she received the best possible care. To assist them, a Scottish-born secretary named Polly Thompson joined the household, soon becoming Helen's new companion and interpreter. In 1936, Anne Sullivan died. For nearly 50 years, she had been Helen's teacher, guardian, and dearest friend. Her passing left a void that could never be filled. Many believed Helen would succumb to grief. Instead, she found strength in Annie's memory. She chose to continue her work, because that is what teacher would have wanted. With Polly Thompson now by her side, Helen resumed her travels on behalf of the Foundation for the Blind. She met President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who, like her, knew the challenge of living with a disability. Together they inspired millions, proving that adversity need not define a life. Helen's efforts led to the creation of programs for blind education, job training, and the introduction of talking books in libraries, innovations that brought independence to thousands. In the late 1930s, Helen toured Japan, where her story was both admired and doubted. The Japanese people, moved by her compassion, presented her with a beautiful Akita dog, the first ever brought to the United States as a symbol of respect. Her visit profoundly changed attitudes toward the blind in Japan, where awareness and support for disability rights soon grew. After World War II, Helen continued her mission on a global scale. She visited hospitals for wounded soldiers and rehabilitation centers around the world, offering hope to those who had lost sight in battle. Her message was simple yet powerful, that courage, not vision, defines human strength. Throughout her lifetime, Helen Keller met every American president from Grover Cleveland to John F. Kennedy. In 1955, she published Teacher, Anne Sullivan Macy, a moving tribute to the woman who had given her the world. 4 years later, The Miracle Worker opened on Broadway, dramatizing Helen's early life and the bond between student and teacher. The play, and later the acclaimed film, introduced her story to new generations. Helen Keller passed away on June 1, 1968, at the age of 87. She left behind no fortune, but a far greater legacy, one of resilience, compassion, and the unyielding belief that no barrier of body or mind could silence the human spirit. Her life remains a testament to what can be achieved when courage meets purpose. Even now, her story continues to illuminate the world.